With the current unprecedented sanctions against Russia, a lot of people are understandably interested in whether they're effective. And to ask whether sanctions are being effective begs the question of effective at what, which is why policymakers are now increasingly giving thought to the issue of the objectives of sanctions. Some of them would say that sanctions are meant to elicit behavior change on the part of Russia. Others would view sanctions as primarily a means of disrupting Russia's malicious activity, and yet others would say that the primary impact of sanctions is likely to be a mere symbolic expression of condemnation of the Russian actions. I fear that to some extent, important though this discussion might be, it might distract us from the bigger question of whether sanctions are worth imposing. And the fact of the matter is that there is a need to impose costs on the aggressor state, Russia, and there are relatively few ways of actually doing so. And so while we should be reflective about the objectives of sanctions, we should be wary of falling into the trap of paralysis by analysis, and therefore we should place the issue of objectives into its broader context. There are very significant amounts of Russian assets that have been frozen across G7 economies, and that includes hundreds of billions in the Russian central bank's foreign currency reserves. This puts Western nations in truly uncharted waters. In previous experiences of imposing sanctions, there was always an understanding that assets can be kept frozen and then reinstated to the owner, either when they no longer present a threat, for example, in the context of counter-terrorism sanctions, or when a rogue government has changed its policies. What makes Russia's case dramatically different is that Russia has wrought tremendous destruction in Ukraine, and under international law, Ukraine is entitled to full reparations, which is an obligation that Russia is evidently unwilling to comply with. And that means that the pool of frozen Russian property is the only realistic source that is available for making those reparations to Ukraine. But that presents formidable legal obstacles, ranging from sovereign immunity in relation to state-owned assets, specifically central bank property, to due process concerns in relation to property that is ostensibly private, but nonetheless connected to the Russian state. The unintended humanitarian consequences of sanctions are an area of great concern in relation to any major sanctions program, and the one against Russia is no exception. Ordinarily, states utilize a variety of techniques to mitigate the impact of sanctions on innocent civilian population, for example by targeting people and companies who are affiliated with the regime in question. In the context of Russia, that is particularly challenging, because in order for sanctions to have a significant impact on the Russian ability to wage war in Ukraine, by definition you need to impact the whole of Russia's economy, and that is bound to have trickle-down effects in terms of declining living standards of the Russian population at large. And we do not currently have a particularly well-developed intellectual toolkit for thinking about the balance between the effectiveness of sanctions and their humanitarian consequences. For the large part, the issue has been moot so far because we have not reached a level at which sanctions would produce tremendous impact on the Russian population. But if that happens in the future, this is something that policymakers will increasingly have to confront, and I think we're bound to see a lot more conversations around that issue.